The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 years. Rosa Martinez rolled over in her narrow bed, her body aching from another double shift at Le Bernardin. The fancy restaurant where she worked was known across Manhattan for its expensive dishes and wealthy customers. But for Rosa, it was just another place where she carried heavy trays and smiled until her cheeks hurt. Her tiny apartment in Queens was nothing like the places she had dreamed of living. The kitchen was so small she could touch both walls with her arms spread wide. The bathroom door didn't close properly, and the heater made strange noises all night. But in the corner, squeezed between her bed and the window, sat the most important thing in her world, an old, upright piano. The piano had seen better days. Some of the keys stuck when she pressed them, and a few made no sound at all. The wood was scratched and faded, and one of the legs wobbled whenever she played too hard. But it was hers, and it was everything. Rosa had found it on the street 5 years ago. Someone was throwing it away, and she couldn't let that happen. She convinced 3 neighbors to help her carry it up 4 flights of stairs. They thought she was crazy for wanting such an old, broken thing. But Rosa saw something they didn't. She saw music waiting to come alive. Every night after work, no matter how tired she was, Rosa sat at that piano. Her fingers moved across the keys like they were greeting old friends. The music that came out was nothing like the quiet, polite sounds you'd hear in the restaurant. This was raw, emotional, real. It told the story of long days on her feet, of dreams that seemed too far away, of a mother who was sick and needed help. The neighbors had complained at first. Mrs. Chung from next door had knocked on the wall more times than Rosa could count. But slowly something changed. Instead of angry knocks, Rosa started hearing people stop in the hallway outside her door. Sometimes she'd see Mrs. Chen's shadow under the door crack, just listening. The building had become quieter during her practice time, as if everyone was holding their breath to hear what came next. Rosa's journey to this small apartment had been long and difficult. She had grown up in a house where music was everything. Her grandmother had taught her to play when she was just 5 years old, sitting beside her on an old bench, guiding her small fingers across the keys. Her grandmother always said that music wasn't just about hitting the right notes, it was about telling your story, sharing your heart with the world. When Rosa was 18, she did something that shocked everyone in her family. She auditioned for Juilliard, one of the most famous music schools in the world. Nobody from her neighborhood had ever even dreamed of going to such a place. But Rosa had a gift that couldn't be ignored. The professors were amazed by her talent. They said she played with a passion they rarely saw. Even in their best students, getting into Juilliard felt like winning the lottery. Rosa worked 3 jobs to pay for her studies. She cleaned offices at night, served coffee in the morning, and gave piano lessons to rich kids in the afternoons. Then she'd rush to her own classes, sometimes so tired she could barely keep her eyes open. But she never missed a practice session, never skipped a lesson. Her professors saw something special in her. They said she had the kind of talent that comes along once in a generation. Her playing wasn't just technically perfect, it had soul. When Rosa played, people didn't just hear music. They felt it in their bones. They felt her grandmother's hands guiding hers, felt the love of a family that had sacrificed everything for her dream, but dreams don't pay bills. In her final year at Juilliard, Rosa's mother was diagnosed with diabetes. The medical bills started piling up like mountains. Her mother needed special medicine, regular doctor visits, and sometimes had to go to the hospital. Rosa's 3 jobs weren't enough anymore. She started missing classes, falling behind in her studies. The night before her final recital, Rosa got a call that changed everything. Her mother was in the hospital again, and the doctor said she needed surgery. Surgery. That would cost more money than Rosa had ever seen in her life. Rosa had 2 choices: perform at her recital and hope for the best, or skip it and pick up extra shifts to earn money for her mother's operation. For Rosa, there was no choice at all. She gave the performance of her life that night, pouring every emotion into the keys. The audience was moved to tears. Her professors said it was the most beautiful playing they had ever heard. But when the applause ended, Rosa knew what she had to do. She graduated with honors, but instead of pursuing a career in music, she took a job at Le Bernardin. The pay was good, and with tips, she could send money home to her mother every month. She told herself it was just temporary, just until her mother got better. But 3 years had passed, and she was still there, still carrying trays instead of playing concert halls. The other servers at Le Bernardin didn't know about her musical background. To them, she was just Rosa, the quiet girl who worked hard and never complained. She listened to their conversations about auditions and dreams, but she never shared her own story. It felt too painful, too personal. The restaurant's customers treated her like she was invisible. They would discuss million-dollar business deals right in front of her as if she wasn't there. They complained about wines that cost more than Rosa. Made in a week. They left tips that were generous to them but meant everything to her money that went straight to her mother's medical bills. Sometimes, late at night in the restaurant, Rosa would look at the beautiful grand piano in the corner of the main dining room. It was a Steinway, worth more than most people's cars. The regular pianist who played during dinner service was technically skilled, but Rosa could hear that he was just going through the motions. He played the same songs every night, the safe choices that wouldn't disturb the diner's conversations. Rosa's fingers would itch to touch those keys. She wondered what it would feel like to play on such a beautiful instrument. But she was just a server, and that piano wasn't for people like her. It was for the professionals, the ones who had made it, the ones who lived the life she had once dreamed of. Every night she went home to her little apartment, to her old piano with its broken keys and wobbling leg. She played for the neighbors who listened through the walls, for her mother who was slowly getting better, and for herself trying to keep the music alive in a world that seemed determined to silence it. Rosa never stopped believing that someday, somehow, she would find her way back to the stage. But as months turned into years, that dream felt further away than ever. She was 28 now, and most successful pianists had established their careers long before her age. The music world was young and competitive, and Rosa was starting to feel like she had missed her chance, but she kept playing anyway because the music was part of her soul. It was the voice she couldn't silence, the dream she couldn't kill, the hope she couldn't abandon. Every night in that small apartment in Queens, Rosa Martinez played like her life depended on it. Because in many ways it did. The snow was falling heavy that Friday evening in December, turning the busy streets of Manhattan into a winter wonderland. But inside Le Bernardin, everything was warm and golden. Tonight wasn't just any regular night at the restaurant. Tonight was special, the kind of special that made Rosa's manager, Vincent, pace around the kitchen like a nervous cat. Everything has to be perfect, Vincent kept saying, wiping sweat from his forehead even though the air conditioning was on full blast. These people could buy and sell this place 10 times over. One mistake, and we're all in trouble. Rosa had been working at fancy restaurants long enough to know what that meant. Tonight's guests weren't just rich, they were the kind of rich that made headlines. The event was a fundraising gala for the New York Philharmonic, and the guest list read like a who's who of American wealth and power. She straightened her black uniform and checked her appearance in the mirror one more time. Her long dark hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her shoes were polished until they shone. Rosa had learned that in places like this, being invisible was an art form. The guests didn't want to see the servers, they wanted their glasses refilled, their plates cleared, and their needs met without having to acknowledge that real people were doing the work. The private dining room had been transformed for the evening. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on the walls, and each table was set with china that probably cost more than Rosa's rent. Fresh flowers filled the room with their sweet smell, and soft jazz music played in the background. In the corner, the restaurant's beautiful grand piano sat like a sleeping giant, waiting for the evening's entertainment. Rosa had seen the pianist arrive earlier, a thin man in his 50s named David who played at high-end events around the city. He seemed nervous, constantly checking his watch and muttering to himself. Rosa had offered him a glass of water, but he barely looked at her. He was in his own world, running through pieces in his head, his fingers moving silently as if he was already playing dot. As the guests began arriving, Rosa felt the familiar shift in the restaurant's energy. These weren't people who came to eat, they came to be seen. The women wore dresses that cost more than most people's cars, and the men's watches could have bought houses. They air-kissed each other, spoke in voices that carried just a little too well, and name-dropped places and people like they were reading from a script. Rosa moved between the tables like a ghost, filling water glasses and serving champagne. She had become an expert at reading these rooms. She knew which guest would complain about the temperature, which one would send back their food, and which one would leave a surprisingly generous tip. Tonight's crowd was different, though. They were all trying to impress each other, which made them even more demanding than usual. "Excuse me," called a woman in a red dress that probably cost more than Rosa made in 6 months. "This champagne is too warm. Bring me another one, and make sure it's properly chilled this time." Rosa smiled politely, even though the champagne was perfectly chilled. "Of course, ma'am." Right away. This was her life now. Smile, nod, and make problems disappear. She had become so good at it that sometimes she forgot she was even a real person with thoughts and feelings and dreams. She was just a pair of hands that carried trays and a voice that said, "Yes, sir," and "Right away, ma'am." The evening's host was a man named Jonathan Whitmore, and even Rosa had heard of him. He was one of those billionaires who seemed to own half of New York. His company built skyscrapers and shopping centers, and his name was on museums and hospitals all over the city. He was shorter than Rosa had expected, with gray hair and kind eyes that actually seemed to see the people serving him. "Thank you," he said when Rosa refilled his water glass. It was such a simple thing, but it caught her off guard. Most guests didn't even notice when she was there. As the dinner service began, Rosa noticed David, the pianist, looking more nervous than before. He kept wiping his hands on his pants and taking deep breaths. She had seen stage fright before. Some of her classmates at Juilliard had struggled with it, but this seemed different. This seemed worse. The first course was served without any problems. Rosa and the other servers moved in perfect sync, trained by years of experience. The guests were talking and laughing, discussing art and politics and business deals. The champagne was flowing, and the mood was light. That's when it happened. Rosa was clearing plates from table 6, when she heard a strange sound from the corner of the room. It was like a gasp, but louder, more desperate. She turned to see David, the pianist, standing beside the piano with his hands shaking uncontrollably. His face was pale and sweat was pouring down his forehead. "I can't," he was saying to himself, but loud enough for people to hear. "I can't do this. I can't breathe." The conversations at nearby tables stopped. People turned to look at what was happening. David was hyperventilating, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His eyes were wide with panic, and he looked like he might collapse at any moment. Rosa dropped what she was doing and rushed over to him. She had seen panic attacks before. Her roommate in college had suffered from them. "Sir, you need to sit down," she said gently, guiding him to a chair. "Try to breathe slowly." But David was beyond hearing her. He was lost in his own fear, trapped in a cycle of panic that was getting worse by the minute. Other servers and restaurant staff gathered around, but none of them knew what to do. The guests were starting to murmur among themselves, and Rosa could feel the mood in the room shifting from elegant to uncomfortable. Vincent, the manager, appeared at Rosa's shoulder. His face was red with stress, and she could see the panic in his eyes. This was his worst nightmare, a disruption at the most important event of the year. "Someone call 911, Vincent whispered urgently, "and figure out what we're going to do about the entertainment." The paramedics arrived within minutes, professional and calm. They helped David onto a stretcher, checking his vital signs and speaking to him in soothing voices. As they wheeled him out of the restaurant, Rosa felt genuinely sorry for him. She knew what it was like to have dreams that felt too big, too scary to handle. But now there was a bigger problem. The evening's program called for live piano music during the main course and after dinner. Without David, there would be awkward Silence in a room full of people who had paid $50,000 a plate to be there. Jonathan Whitmore approached Vincent, his voice low but urgent. We need to figure something out. These people are expecting entertainment, and frankly, this event is too important to let fall apart. Vincent was sweating even more now. I'm making calls, he said, pulling out his phone. But it's Friday night. In December, every pianist in the city is already booked. Rosa watched this conversation from across the room, her heart going out to Vincent. She had seen him work 18-hour days to make sure events like this went perfectly. He was a good man who cared about his staff and his restaurant's reputation. The guests were getting restless. Some were checking their phones, others were talking louder than before. The carefully orchestrated evening was starting to fall apart, and everyone could feel it. That's when Vincent remembered something. Earlier that week, he had been going through employee files, updating information for the year-end reviews. He had been surprised to discover that Rosa had studied music at Juilliard. He had meant to ask her about it, but the busy holiday season had pushed it from his mind. Now, standing in a room full of New York's elite with no pianist and no backup plan, Vincent found himself looking at Rosa with new eyes. It was crazy, it was desperate. It was probably a terrible idea, but sometimes when you're out of options, terrible ideas start to look like the only choice you have. Vincent's hand was shaking as he approached Rosa. She was still cleaning up the area where the paramedics had worked on David, folding napkins and straightening chairs, as if keeping busy could somehow make the chaos disappear. The conversations in the room had died down to uncomfortable whispers, and everyone seemed to be waiting for something to happen. Rosa, Vincent said quietly, pulling her aside. I need to ask you something, and I know it sounds crazy. She looked up at him, surprised by the serious tone in his voice. Vincent was usually calm and collected, but tonight he looked like a man who was drowning and searching for anything to keep him afloat. I was looking at your employee file earlier this week, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. It says you went to Juilliard. It says you studied piano. Rosa's heart stopped. She had hoped that detail would stay buried in paperwork, something that nobody would ever notice or care about. Her past life felt like a secret she had been carrying. For 3 years, too painful to share with anyone. Vincent, she started, but he interrupted her. Rosa, I wouldn't ask if I wasn't desperate. These people paid $50,000 each to be here tonight. If this event falls apart, it's not just my job on the line, it's everyone's. The restaurant's reputation, the staff's livelihood, everything we've worked for. She could see the desperation in his eyes, and her heart went out to him. But the thought of playing in front of these people, these wealthy strangers who had treated her like she was invisible for 3 years, made her stomach turn with fear. I don't know if I can, she whispered back. It's been so long since I played for anyone but myself. And these people, they're not exactly my audience. Vincent grabbed her hands, and she could feel how cold they were. Rosa, I've seen you work. You're calm under pressure, you care about doing things right. I know this is asking a lot, but I also know you're the only chance we have. Across the room, Jonathan Whitmore was watching their conversation with interest. He had built his fortune by reading people, by spotting potential where others saw problems. Something about the way Vincent was talking to the young server caught his attention. Rosa looked over at the piano. That beautiful Steinway that had been calling to her for 3 years. She thought about all the nights she had dreamed of playing. Something so magnificent, all the time she had wondered what it would feel like to touch those perfect keys. What if I mess up? She asked, her voice barely audible. What if you don't? Vincent replied. The room was getting more restless by the minute. Some guests were starting to check their phones, others were glancing at their watches. The energy that had been so perfect earlier was slipping away, and everyone could feel it. Rosa closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that music wasn't about perfect technique or fancy venues. It was about sharing something real, something true. She thought about her mother, who had sacrificed so much for Rosa's dreams. She thought about all those nights in her small apartment, playing for neighbors who listened through the walls. Okay, she said finally. "I'll try." Vincent's relief was visible. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you so much." But as Rosa started walking toward the piano, her legs felt like they were made of rubber. Every step seemed to echo in the room, and she could feel eyes turning toward her. These people who had looked through her for 3 years were suddenly very aware of her presence. She reached the piano and stood there for a moment, just staring at the keys. Her server's uniform felt wrong in this moment, too simple and plain for what she was about to do. But it was also honest. It was who she had become, and maybe that was okay. Jonathan Whitmore stood up from his table. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying across the room. "Due to our pianist's medical emergency, one of Le Bernardin's staff members has graciously agreed to provide our evening's entertainment." The room fell completely silent. Rosa could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Some faces showed curiosity, others showed skepticism. A few people were clearly wondering what a server could possibly offer them musically. Rosa sat down at the piano bench and adjusted it slightly. The moment her fingers touched the keys, something magical happened. All the fear, all the doubt, all the worry about what these people thought of her, it all melted away. The piano was like an old friend she hadn't seen in years, welcoming her back home. She started with something simple, something that felt safe. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece her grandmother had taught her when she was 12 years old. The first notes floated across the room like a whisper, soft and gentle and achingly beautiful. The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the servers who had been clearing tables froze in place, listening to sounds they had never heard before. Rosa let the music tell her story. Each note carried the weight of her dreams, the pain of her struggles, the love for her family. She played with the passion of someone who had been silent for too long, who had finally found her voice again. As she moved through the piece, she could feel something changing in the room. The skeptical faces were softening. The people who had treated her like furniture were seeing her as a human being for the first time. The music was building a bridge between her world and theirs, creating a connection that had nothing to do with money or status. When the nocturne ended, Rosa didn't stop. She transitioned seamlessly into Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, adapted for solo piano. This piece was more complex, more demanding, but also more emotional. It was the piece she had played for her final recital at Juilliard, the last time she had performed for an audience. Her fingers flew across the keys with a precision that comes from years of training and a passion that comes from the soul. The music filled every corner of the room, touching hearts that had been closed for too long. She played with the technique of a master and the emotion of someone who had lived every note. In the audience, people were experiencing something they hadn't felt in years. These were individuals who could buy anything they wanted, who had seen the world's greatest performers, who thought they had experienced everything life had to offer. But there was something about Rosa's playing that was different. It wasn't just technically perfect, it was real. Jonathan Whitmore found tears streaming down his face. He had been to hundreds of concerts, had heard legendary pianists perform in the world's greatest concert halls. But he had never heard anything like this. This wasn't just music, it was a story, a confession, a prayer. A woman at table 3 clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wide with wonder. "My God," she whispered, "where did she learn to play like that?" The piece built to its dramatic climax, Rosa's whole body moving with the music. Her years of struggle, her dreams deferred, her love for her family, it all poured out through her fingertips. The piano responded like it had been waiting for her all along, its voice rich and full and perfectly tuned. As the final notes hung in the air, Rosa sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the keys. She had forgotten where she was, forgotten about the uniform she was wearing, forgotten about the dirty dishes waiting in the kitchen. For those few minutes, she had been exactly who she was meant to be. The silence that followed was profound. It was the kind of silence that comes after something extraordinary has happened, when people need a moment to process what they've just experienced. Rosa looked up at the faces around her, and for the first time in 3 years she felt truly seen. The silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Rosa sat frozen at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys, afraid to move or breathe or do anything that might break the spell. She had poured her entire soul into those pieces, and now she felt completely vulnerable, like she had just shown her diary to a room full of strangers. She could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. The room was so quiet that she could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic on the street below, even the gentle tick of someone's expensive watch. It was the kind of silence that makes you wonder if time has stopped moving. Then slowly, Jonathan Whitmore began to stand. He pushed back his chair with deliberate care, his movements measured and purposeful. His eyes never left Rosa's face, and she could see something there that she had never seen before, not just in him, but in any of the wealthy customers she had served over the years. It was respect, it was recognition. It was the look of someone who had just witnessed something extraordinary. His hands came together once, twice, 3 times. The sound of his clapping seemed impossibly loud in the silent room, but he didn't stop. He kept applauding, and with each clap, his pace grew faster, more insistent, more passionate. One by one, the other guests began to follow his lead. A woman in a diamond necklace stood up, her face streaked with tears. She didn't seem to realize she was crying. A man in an expensive suit joined them, his usual stern expression replaced by something softer, more human. Then another, and another, until the entire room was on its feet. The applause built like a wave, starting as individual claps and growing into something powerful and unified. These were people who attended galas and charity events every week, who had seen famous musicians perform at Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall. They knew what good music sounded like, and they knew when they had witnessed something special. Rosa sat at the piano, overwhelmed by the response. She had dreamed of moments like this during her years at Juilliard, but she had never imagined it would happen like this, in a restaurant, wearing a server's uniform, playing for people who had ignored her existence for 3 years. The applause seemed to go on forever. Some people were wiping tears from their eyes, others were shaking their heads in amazement. The sound filled the room, bounced off the walls, and seemed to wrap around Rosa like a warm embrace. Finally, as the applause began to die down, Jonathan Whitmore stepped forward. He walked across the room with purpose, his eyes never leaving Rosa's face. When he reached the piano, he extended his hand to help her stand. "That," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." Rosa took his hand and stood up, her legs still shaky from the adrenaline. Up close, she could see that his eyes were bright with unshed tears. This man who could buy and sell companies, who had his name on buildings across the city, was genuinely moved by her music. "I don't know what to say," Rosa whispered, her voice barely audible. "You don't need to say anything," Jonathan replied. "You just said everything that needed to be said." But the evening was far from over. As Rosa stood beside the piano, other guests began approaching her. These were the same people who had barely acknowledged her when she was serving their food, who had treated her like she was invisible. Now they were looking at her with new eyes, seeing her as a person worthy of their attention and respect. A woman in an elegant black dress approached first. Rosa recognized her. She was a regular customer who always ordered the same wine and never said thank you. But now she was looking at Rosa with wonder. "My dear," the woman said, her voice soft with emotion, "I had no idea. Where did you learn to play like that?" Before Rosa could answer, a man in a navy suit joined the conversation. "That was incredible," he said, shaking his head. "I've been to every major concert hall in the world, and I've never heard anything like that. It was so real." More people gathered around, creating a small crowd near the piano. Everyone wanted to talk to her, to understand how someone they had overlooked for so long could possess such extraordinary talent. "Are you recording anything?" asked a woman with silver hair and kind eyes. "Because you should be. The world needs." To hear this, Rosa felt overwhelmed by all the attention. For 3 years, she had been practically invisible in this room. Now she was the center of attention, and she didn't know how to handle it. Vincent appeared at her side, his face beaming with pride and relief. Rosa has been with us for 3 years, he announced to the small crowd. She's one of our hardest workers, always professional, always dedicated. We had no idea about her musical background. 3 years? Jonathan Whitmore looked shocked. You mean you've been working here, serving tables, this whole time? Rosa nodded, suddenly embarrassed. I needed the job, she said simply. My mother was sick, and the medical bills ... But you're a trained musician, said a man she recognized as a famous art dealer. You should be performing, recording, touring. What are you doing waiting tables? The question hung in the air, and Rosa felt the weight of it. How could she explain? That dreams don't pay bills? That sometimes life forces you to make choices you never wanted to make? That talent doesn't guarantee success? Sometimes life doesn't go the way you plan, she said quietly. Jonathan Whitmore stepped closer, his expression serious. May I ask where you studied? Juilliard, Rosa replied, and she heard several people gasp. Juilliard? The silver-haired woman looked stunned. And you've been working as a server? The crowd around Rosa grew larger as word spread through the room. People were pulling out their phones, not to ignore her as they usually did, but to capture this moment, to share what they had just witnessed. This is extraordinary, said a woman Rosa recognized as a prominent philanthropist. Absolutely extraordinary. Do you have representation? A manager? An agent? Rosa shook her head. I haven't played professionally in 3 years. Well, that's about to change, Jonathan said firmly. He pulled out his phone and started scrolling through his contacts. I know people, good people. People who understand talent when they see it. The conversation was interrupted by a young man who had been quietly filming with his phone. Ma'am, he said to Rosa, I hope you don't mind, but I recorded part of your performance. It's incredible. Would it be okay if I shared it? Rosa looked uncertain. She had never been on social media, had never thought about her music going viral or being shared with strangers around the world. Trust me, Jonathan sighed, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. The world needs to hear this. Your story needs to be told. As the evening continued, Rosa found herself in conversation after conversation. People were asking about her background, her training, her dreams. They were treating her like an artist, like someone whose opinion mattered, like someone worth knowing. A well-dressed couple approached her with business cards. We run a talent agency, the woman explained. We'd love to talk to you about representation. Another man, who Rosa learned was a record producer, handed her his card as well. This is the most authentic performance I've heard in years, he said. There's something about your playing that's just ... honest, real. That's rare in this business. The evening that had started as a disaster was turning into something magical. Rosa felt like she was in a dream, surrounded by people who were offering her the very opportunities she had given up on years ago. As the night wound down, Jonathan Whitmore pulled her aside one more time. Rosa, he said, his voice serious, I want you to know that what happened here tonight was special. But it was also just the beginning. If you're willing, I'd like to help you get back to where you belong. Rosa looked around the room at all the faces that had been transformed by her music, at all the people who had seen her as a person for the first time. She thought about her mother, who had sacrificed so much for her dreams. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that music was about touching hearts, not just hitting the right notes. I think I'd like that, she said, her voice strong with newfound confidence. The server who had been invisible for 3 years was invisible. No more. 3 weeks later, Rosa's phone wouldn't stop ringing. The video of her performance had exploded across social media platforms, gathering millions of views and thousands of comments from people around the world. The young man who had recorded it had tagged it with a simple caption, Server at fancy restaurant turns out to be a musical genius. This gave me chills. The comments were overwhelming. People were calling her an inspiration, sharing their own stories of hidden talents and deferred dreams. Music teachers were showing the video to their students. Other servers and restaurant workers were commenting about their own secret skills and passions. Rosa sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone in disbelief. The same piano that had been her only companion for 3 years was now surrounded by flowers, gifts, and letters from strangers who had been moved by her story. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chun, had knocked on her door that morning with tears in her eyes. "I always knew you were special," Mrs. Chun had said, hugging Rosa tightly. "Every night when you played, I would sit by my wall and listen. It was the most beautiful part of my day." The phone calls started coming in almost immediately after the video went viral. Record labels, talent agencies, concert promoters, and music managers all wanted to meet with her. Rosa, who had been invisible for 3 years, suddenly found herself in demand by people who had never heard of her a month ago, but the most important call came from Jonathan Whitmore himself. He had been true to his word, making connections and opening doors that Rosa had thought were closed forever. "Rosa," he said when she answered the phone, "I have some news that I think will change your life." He had arranged for her to meet with Patricia Wells, one of the most respected talent managers in the classical music world. Patricia represented Grammy winners and international stars, people who performed at the world's greatest concert halls. The meeting took place in a glass office building in Manhattan that Rosa had walked past hundreds of times on her way to work. Now she was taking the elevator to the 32nd floor, wearing the only professional outfit she owned, a simple black dress she had bought for job interviews. 3 years ago, Patricia Wells was not what Rosa had expected. She was a small woman with gray hair and a warm smile, and she made Rosa feel comfortable immediately. "I've watched your video about 50 times, Patricia said, settling into her chair, "and each time I get goosebumps. There's something about your playing that's just authentic. In a world full of technically perfect musicians, you have something that can't be taught." They talked for 2 hours about Rosa's background, her dreams, and what she wanted her career to look like. Patricia was honest about the challenges. Rosa was older than most emerging artists, and she had been out of the professional music world for years. But she was also excited about the possibilities. "Your story is compelling," Patricia explained. "People are hungry for authenticity, for real human stories. You're not just another trained musician. You're someone who has lived, who has struggled, who has something to say." Within a week, Patricia had arranged Rosa's first professional performance in 3 years. It was a small venue in Brooklyn, nothing like the concert halls Rosa had dreamed of, but it was a start. The show sold out in 2 hours. Standing backstage before her performance, Rosa felt the familiar butterflies in her stomach. But this time they felt different. They felt like excitement rather than fear. She was wearing a simple black dress. Elegant but not flashy, and for the first time in years, she felt like herself. The audience was unlike anything she had experienced at Juilliard or in her dreams of classical concerts. There were young people and old people, families and couples, people in suits and people in jeans. They were there because they had seen her video, because they had been moved by her story. When Rosa walked onto the stage, the applause was immediate and warm. She sat at the piano, another beautiful Steinway, and felt that familiar sense of coming home. 3 weeks ago," she said into the microphone, "I was serving tables at a restaurant in Manhattan. I had given up on my dream of being a professional musician, but sometimes life surprises you in the most unexpected ways." She told them about that night at Le Bernardin, about the panic attack that had changed everything, about the moment when she decided to take a chance on herself. The audience listened in complete silence, hanging on every word. Then she played. She started with the same Chopin nocturne that had started it all, but this time it felt different. This time, she wasn't playing for people who had ignored her existence. She was playing for people who had chosen to be there, who wanted to hear her story. The concert was magical. Rosa played pieces that told her story, the struggles, the dreams, the love for her family, the years of silence, and finally, the joy of finding her voice again. The audience was with her every step of the way, laughing and crying and applauding with genuine enthusiasm. After the show, people lined up to meet her. They weren't wealthy socialites or music industry professionals. They were regular people who had been touched by her music and her story. "Thank you," said a young woman who couldn't have been more than 20. I'm a waitress too, and I sing. I was about to give up on my dream, but watching you it gives me hope. An older man shook her hand with tears in his eyes. My wife and I have been married for 40 years, he said. We haven't held hands during music in decades. But tonight, listening to you play, we remembered what it felt like to be young and in love. The success of that first concert led to more opportunities. Rosa was invited to perform at festivals, to record with established musicians, to appear on television shows, but she never forgot where she came from or the people who had supported her journey. Jonathan Whitmore had made good on another promise. He had taken care of her mother's medical bills and had set up a fund to help other struggling artists. Rosa's mother was finally getting the treatment she needed, and for the first time in years, Rosa didn't have to worry about money. You gave me back my daughter, her mother said during one of their weekly phone calls. For 3 years I watched you work so hard, sacrifice so much. I was proud of you, but I was also heartbroken. Now I can hear the joy in your voice again. 6 months after that fateful night at Le Bernardin, Rosa found herself back at the restaurant. But this time she wasn't carrying trays or serving champagne. She was the featured performer at another gala, wearing an elegant gown and sitting at the same piano where her life had changed. Vincent introduced her to the audience, his voice full of pride. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my honor to present someone who has been part of our Le Bernardin family for 3 years. Please welcome Rosa Martinez. The applause was thunderous. Many of the faces in the audience were the same ones who had been there that December night, but they were looking at her completely differently now. She was no longer invisible. She was seen, valued, celebrated. As Rosa began to play, she thought about her journey. She thought about her grandmother, who had taught her that music was about touching hearts. She thought about all the nights in her small apartment, playing for neighbors through thin walls. She thought about the dreams that had seemed impossible, and the courage it had taken to try again. Her first album, The Silver Symphony, had debuted at #1 on the classical charts. She had been invited to perform at Carnegie Hall, Lincoln Center, and concert halls around the world. But in many ways, this moment at Le Bernardin felt like the most important performance of her life. When she finished playing, Rosa stood and took her bow. The audience rose to their feet, applauding not just for her music, but for her courage, her perseverance, and her reminder that extraordinary things can happen when we're brave enough to share our true selves with the world. Later that evening, Rosa walked through the restaurant where she had worked for 3 years. The other servers, many of whom had become close friends, congratulated her and shared their own dreams and aspirations. Rosa realized that her story had given them permission to believe in themselves too. As she left the restaurant that night, Rosa passed the small apartment building where she still lived. She could have moved to a fancy place in Manhattan, but she loved her neighborhood and the people who had supported her journey. Mrs. Chun waved from her window, and Rosa waved back with a smile. The old piano was still in her apartment, still wobbling on its uneven leg. But now it was surrounded by awards, flowers, and letters from fans around the world. It was proof that dreams don't have expiration dates, that it's never too late to take a chance on yourself, and that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places.